Savannah Guthrie is the co-anchor of the Today Show and NBC News' chief legal correspondent. She's also the author of Mostly What God Does, Reflections on Seeking and Finding His Love Everywhere. I want to be clear, this is the real Savannah Guthrie we're talking to, not the AI or deep fake Savannah Guthrie. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I first want to talk about the impetus for the book, because when you told me about it, we text from time to time, you said it's not what you think it's going to be. And you were almost apologetic. It was interesting. And that this would surprise people who know you as Savannah Guthrie, journalist, interviewer. You do tough interviews. You're on the Today Show. You're very well known. You're talking about your faith here. Talk to me about what the impetus was, because I was surprised, actually. I had no idea.
I know. I was surprised, too. And, I mean, almost apologetic is just my zone. You know, that's where I live. That's the emotional space I inhabit for most of my day. But, you know, honestly, my faith has been important to me. It always has been, and all my close friends and my colleagues, everyone knows that. So I don't mean that they would be surprised, but more that I was surprised that it was something I wanted to write about or put out there publicly, not because I was ashamed, but because it's so personal. It's so vulnerable. I mean, if you're going to write a book about faith and it is in any way authentic, then you're more or less putting your heart out there. And in this world, which I don't have to remind you, that's really terrifying. And so for me to put it out there like that, I'm certainly not holding myself up as any kind of model of behavior or anything. I'm not any kind of theologian or biblical scholar. It's just reflections from a real person, a real life, learning more from disappointments and setbacks than any triumph.
So one of the things, though, is let's leave aside the performative people who talk about religion, who do it for some other reason. You were a quiet, faithful person, as most people are. You know what I mean? That people, they don't. Do you think people are scared? Not scared and ashamed to talk about it, but because it's so personal. That's why you don't talk about it, or publicly, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, everyone knows. Yeah, publicly. I mean, I have talked about it, you know, from time to time, which is how this opportunity to write about it came to me. You know, I've certainly never run from it, but, you know, I think people are quiet about their faith because, for one thing, isn't the mantra you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics?
Well, yes, it is, but that doesn't happen.
One of those
that
has to hold. Yes, it doesn't. But also because, you know, I'm not out here trying to proselytize or persuade. The truth of the matter is, I never thought I would write a book about God. I never thought I'd write any book. And I didn't want to, really. I was happy to just have this be something personal to me. But when the opportunity came up, I found myself not able to say the immediate no I've said to every other offer of any kind of writing whatsoever. And the reason was because it seemed intriguing. It seemed challenging. It seemed terrifying. And it's the subject I'm most passionate and interested in. And I'm always telling, you know, especially young producers or interns or people that have ever asked me for advice, I always say, you know, get out of your comfort zone. Anything interesting you do in your life will be outside your comfort zone. It's on the other side of a big risk that you take. And it had been a while since I had taken my own advice. And so I thought, I'm going to try.
So you write a lot about some deep, by the way, it's a bestseller, so people are responding to it. In the book, you write about some deeply personal topics, including the loss of your father, who died when you were teenagers. You also talk about your husband and your kids and how you see both marriage and parenthood as metaphors for relationships with God. Talk a little bit about this, why you wrote it the way you did.
Well, the big revelation is mostly what God does. That's the title of the book. And the rest of the sentence is mostly what God does is love you. And I grew up in the church. I had a traditional kind of Baptist upbringing, and there's a lot about that I still love and treasure. But there was also a lot of guilt and shame and rules and a sense for me of always failing, never measuring up, and always kind of wondering what this looming God figure might have thought of me. And through a life of, again, more mistakes than anything else, what I came to realize is that mostly what God is doing at any given time is loving us. It comes actually from Scripture. It comes from a verse in Ephesians that was retranslated by a scholar named Eugene Peterson. And the verse goes, watch what God does, and you do it too, the way children learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. When I read that sentence years and years ago, it was a radical reframing of how I thought about God, rather than this angry taskmaster scolding or being disappointed or, you know, having a bill of particulars of all the ways we and all of humanity fails. mostly what God is doing is loving you. That's true for me. It's true for you. It's even true for Scott.
He's going to talk. He's going to talk in a minute. He comes in with the big.
I'm teasing, but the thing is that I wrote about it in the terms of parenthood, because that was another moment where when I had kids, I was in my 40s. I was so lucky to get to have kids at that late date, long after I thought I had screwed up everything and would never have my chance. And to have a child is truly the most, I think, the closest we'll ever get to understanding how God relates to us. You know, we love our kids. We're amazed by our kids. We delight in our kids. We relish their little accomplishments. We delight in their milestones. We not only love them, we often like them. We adore them. Well, that's how God feels about every human being. And I'm not making this up.
There's other versions.
This is the very metaphor
that God uses.
Yes,
there are other versions of it.
Yes.
Scott, why don't you come in here? By the way, you know God is dog spelled backwards, so dog.
There you go. Savannah, it's really nice to meet you.
Hi, Scott.
First off, congratulations on your success. I think this is a brave book for someone in your position to write, because you're just subjecting yourself to a lot of scrutiny and your vulnerability, and I can see why it's a bestseller. So acknowledging that, I love what you've written. I love what David Brooks has written about the importance of community and how much comfort religion gives people, and that there's definitely a hole in American society where people are having trouble finding each other and the agency of something bigger than them, and religion plays an incredibly important role. And as a devout atheist, I also want to acknowledge that I think we would probably benefit from an upsurge in religious institutions in America. Having said that, I worry, or what would you do to provide comfort to people when you say mostly what God does? What I see mostly God being used for, quite frankly, right now, is oftentimes good people do good things, bad people do bad things. When good people do horrendous things, usually God is at the center, or some form of their vision of God. And what I see in America is that religion and legislation, that the line is being blurred and being used for, quite frankly, incredible misogyny, incredible discrimination. So what would you do to provide comfort to people that recognize the importance that church plays, but see increasingly that God is being, if you will, weaponized?
Well, I understand those sentiments. You know, I live in the real world too. And, you know, I write a lot about doubt in the book. And the doubt isn't, does God exist? The doubt, the crucible of doubt for any deeply thinking, faithful person is, where is God? You know, why would a good God allow unmerited suffering?
Yeah, you
As
say
for
this.
what you're talking about,
you say this
Yeah.
in one chapter. You write, waking each morning to an overnight news summary, which often has a headline after headline of bad news. You wrote, it feels like taking 20 punches to the gut in rapid succession.
Yeah. And I mean, I hear and understand exactly what Scott is laying out. I mean, again, I live in this world too. I would only say that what you're describing has more to do with humans than it does to do with God. And I understand, but I would say try to get back to the source material. Go back to basics. You know, look for
Love
God
the poor.
for yourself.
Yeah.
Look within. I mean, looking out in the world, frankly, any human institution and every human, even our most treasured and most devout or most faithful or most moral humans we have, they're still human. And this is, in my faith view, this is not the world that God intended. We live in a broken world. And there's just no getting around that. And P.S., I don't have the answers to that in this little yellow book. I don't. The only thing I say is that I believe that God yearns to engage with us even on our doubts, even with our doubts. In fact, I think that's part of faith. I think doubt is kind of faith being worked out. It's not an exception to faith. It's an aspect of faith. Indifference and apathy, now that might get you a little more to opposite of faith. So I understand all those doubts, and I don't try to run from them. I try to explain how I have dealt with them either personally with my own setbacks or the world that I see that breaks my heart every single day.
What do you say to? He just said he's a devout atheist, right? Scott just did. I happen to be more of an agnostic because I don't know, and
Which
every
means
now
you're a
and
closeted atheist, but anyway.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not, because I've been literally walking by churches recently and thinking I'd like to go in.
Agreed.
I don't know why. I don't know. I don't go in. By
Community.
the way.
I'm
Maybe.
sorry, I don't mean to answer for you. Go ahead, Carrie.
Okay, I don't know. I don't know. No, it's something else. I don't know what it is. It's not. I don't want to see more people, Scott. That's something I want to do the opposite of. But what? It's true, Savannah.
I know.
Who are you writing for? Are you writing to reach those people, or what's the goal here for you?
I mean, the book is not for any particular person. I really mean that it is not in any way proselytizing. If it's persuasive, that's not what it's intended to do. It's a description of a relationship with God, and I hope that it's ultimately appealing, because I think God is quite compelling. So I write about, there's a chapter called The Fragrance of the Gospel, right, which is a line from Scripture. But I say, the idea is it's a fragrance, right? It's not a stench, it's not an odor, it's not the person next to you wearing too much perfume. It's a fragrance. I hope that a life that is lived with recognition that God loves every human heart, yourself, and every human you see on the street, I hope that life carries a fragrance that is appealing and compelling. But no, I'm not trying to write to any particular person. I'm trying to write to every particular person who cares to pick up this book. And in a lot of ways, I'm writing to myself, because this encouragement is something I need all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, I still need to be reminded that God loves me, that even more radically, that God could like me.
Yeah.
I mean, if you could let that in, if you could really let it in, even for a moment, mm-hmm. It's pretty transformative, but it's not the kind of thing that you learn once and then it stands for all time. It's like when you get married, you don't say, I love you, sweetie, and then in 30 years, you're like, remember I told you on our wedding day? No, you are in it every single day, mm-hmm. and you have to continue to seek that connection, and that's how I think about faith as well.
Scott? By the way, I love you, Scott. Sorry, go ahead.
I love you too, Kara. Thank you for saying that. So I'm asking this question.
Should I leave?
No, it's okay.
So I'm asking this question generally looking for an answer, not as a comment. What advice, I know you have kids, I have 13 and 16-year-old boys, and I genuinely struggle with the role that I should play in determining what the role religion should play in their life. As someone who believes at some point I'll look into their eyes and I believe our relationship will come to an end when I die, I also recognize, as someone who spent a lot of time in temples and churches, that there is something wonderful for kids about being involved in a religious institution. But I struggle with how to incorporate it in a thoughtful way. Anyways, what advice would you have for someone who, buys into the institutions, not necessarily the lineage, and sees some of the danger? And quite frankly, if I woke up one day and my kid was super religious, I got to be honest with you, Savannah, I would be heartbroken. But at the same time, I realize the value it can play in their lives, and I want to incorporate it in a thoughtful way. What advice would you have for parents that feel the same way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm definitely, with you asked me, but I definitely do not present myself as somebody who could give any kind of advice on parenting, as I'm just struggling along blindly myself. Yeah. But I'll tell you what I do. My husband is Jewish. We have an interfaith household. What I have decided, and this is a little different because I do carry a deep faith within me. So what I try to do is share that with my kids. Mm-hmm. And yes, to a certain extent, you're talking about religious institutions. I go to church. I've always belonged to a religious institution, but to me, I don't let the religious institutions, I don't let them ruin God for me. Mm-hmm. I try to know God for myself, know Jesus for himself through scriptures, through prayer, through personal interaction. And of our religious institutions, which are imperfect as all humans are, I try to take with grace the best that they have to offer and then have grace with their failings. But what I try to do is teach my kids about the God that I know, and not just in a way of dragging them to church, although I do. My sister says, in our growing up, she said God was the sixth member of our family. And what she meant by that was we were always kind of in conversation with God or about God. And when my kids have a problem, I might introduce God into the topic. Now, this is easier for me because I believe in God and you don't. But I think that's how I try to do it. And don't have those feelings. You feel strongly, that's different. But if somebody was wondering, they might just say, especially with a 13 and 16-year-old, I have no doubt your boys are quite smart as you are. It's okay if you want to investigate that a little bit. And you have to understand that faith it's intellectual, but it's also spiritual and emotional. We're on multi-dimensional realms here, okay? So, nobody can sit here and prove it to you and give you a set of facts. Even if they gave you incontrovertible facts, that wouldn't be enough. Faith is, in the end, a leap. And if I had older kids, I think that's what I'd say to them. My little kids, they're 7 and 9 now. As they start to ask questions, my view is I've told them what I know. They will choose for themselves their faith or no faith at all. And that will be their choice. I only know my responsibility is to expose them.
How do you
to the
incorporate
God that I know?
your husband being Jewish? How do you incorporate? Because there's a lot of families like this. There's like my wife is Jewish, but we haven't done anything at all. And I wouldn't bring them to church. Although with my older kids, what my ex-wife did was she took them to all different churches all the time. Like she would go to a temple, she would go to a Sikh temple, she would go to a Baptist. She brought them to a lot. Unitarian was where she tended to zero out on, but she took them to a lot of places, which I thought was kind of a great idea. I didn't.
I think. Look, my view is sort of give God some access to their hearts and let Him do the rest. Why do we act like what we say is somehow going to be what they end up believing anyway? Mm-hmm. So I feel a responsibility because I do feel my faith so strongly that I want to share with them what I know. My husband, he comes from the Jewish tradition and he shares his traditions, and we let those all live alongside each other. Now look, we don't have to get into chapter and verse why at some point, although there's so much in common between our faiths, why at some point there may be questions and a conflict. And when that day comes, I hope that we can answer it with as much love, understanding, grace, and humility as possible for all we know and all we don't know. But, my kids used to go, they don't go to this school anymore, but it wasn't a religious school, but it was an old religious school, but 100 years later in New York City, it didn't. But they still had chapel every week. And what I loved about it was, the chapel had nothing religious in it, but it was space and time for something other than the here and now, for something other than what's right in front of you. So maybe it's a long-winded way of getting to something of an answer, Scott, which is to, however you do it, to leave a little space. And if God chooses to enter that space, well, won't you be lucky, even though, Scott, you'll be in despair.
Why should anything change? Why should anything change?
Well, you know what, Scott? My big view, and I write about this in the book, is God speaks our language. You open your heart and you give a little access point, then let God do the rest. He's God. You're not.
Or not. That was just
or not if you're you. But
as you
may be surprised.
Yes, as you were sitting here thinking, the reason I am interested, I grew up Catholic, and they hated gay people. They did, and that was what made me reject it so strongly. One of the things, and I thought they were horrible in so many ways. The people that ran the church, including around sexual assault and stuff. But one of the things that I think I'm attracted to is the quiet. It's so quiet in there. And I think you're right. Being quiet is a very difficult thing these days. I'm going to ask you one more question. Scott may have one more, but I do have to ask you about these AI-generated companion workbooks being sold to a company. Your book, mine are, there's full books of Kara Swisher with really creepy-looking Kara Swisher faces on them.
You look hot.
You
look
I
hot
don't
in
look
those
hot.
photos.
Stop it. And this
Looks
is
like
not
the
going there
Cinemax
right now. With
version of
Savannah, we
Kara.
have a
You
nice
look
guest
hot.
in our thing. We have a nice lady with us. Stop it. What did you think when you brought them up to me? What did you think when you first saw them pop up? And these are
I was shocked.
workbooks that
Yes.
they sell them to accompany your book, and you had nothing to do with them. And you could do a workbook, for example.
Well, yes. And here's the thing. My mother's the one who told me about it. She said, "Oh, honey, I bought your workbook." I'm like, "What workbook?"
Right.
And then she told me to look it up, and then I saw it. And what is horrifying about it is, first of all, who knows what the heck it says with our names on it? Mm-hmm. But also, people spend their real money. It's not like it's $1. It was $14.99. Mm-hmm. Actually, at one of my book events, this nice lady brought it to me. She said, "I just wanted you to know there are these fake workbooks." And I said, "Oh, hon, I'm all over it. I know." And I, of course, immediately said it to the publisher, but there's very little they can do. I don't understand it, totally from a legal perspective. If there's a true likeness to your book, like there were a few that came on that were light yellow like mine, they could get those taken down, but the others they don't. And it's just really unfortunate because people are spending their money on it. And also for authors and even publishers, that's a book not sold.
Right.
If somebody's buying a
100%.
workbook that's
I
fake.
hope I complained to the CEO of Amazon on your behalf. So I just was
Thank you.
It was like crazy, but they can't do anything. Scott, final question.
So when you and your boyfriend, now husband, were thinking about building a life together, and I don't know if you had the conversation around religion, but it's unlikely unless people meet at church or temple that their exact views on this topic calibrate perfectly. And did you have conversations around this? Did you find you needed to accommodate? Did one person grow into it more than the other? Was it less important to one person than the other, so it shaped more around who it was important to? Talk about how you decided that religion should morph or not, such that you could shape a life together.
We talked about it a lot. And, of course, I came up in a tradition where you weren't supposed to marry outside the faith. And I think his tradition probably was the same as well. So right there, we're already, heretics in some sense. But we talked about it a ton. And we actually, this isn't the only reason that we faffed around and dated for 5 long years before getting married. But it is one of the topics that came up. How can we make this work and still have integrity with both of our faiths? And that's something that we're trying to do and not water down either one. And I kind of indicated this, when they're little, it's easier to do that. When they're older, I anticipate, because I believe my kids, I hope I'm raising smart thinking kids who aren't afraid to ask hard questions. I anticipate that will come up and that we will deal with it as it does. But what I knew I couldn't do was in any way water down or walk away from my faith. And my husband has known this about me since our very first date, and in no way would ever ask me to. I have to give him a ton of credit too. I mean, for me to not only be this person, but then to be in this strange position where now I'm writing a book about faith, which is so out there. He never once was like, well, that's great, sweetie, but do you need to? He completely and totally supported me, which I am so grateful for. And the biggest thing I've learned is whether you have a lot of faith or a lot of doubt or something altogether different, I do think, to your point, Scott, people long for connection. And they want to have conversations that are deep and meaningful. And I've had more conversations, even with friends I've had forever, since writing this book. I mean, even Kara and I, who are text besties, and we've talked about a lot of things. And when I said, I'm writing this book, that opened up a conversation or a lane of conversation we hadn't had before. And I loved that she was so open and interested and said, I love talking to people about faith. It doesn't mean I agree with your faith. It means, isn't it interesting to have these conversations?
It is.
Isn't this more valuable to spend time talking about what you believe, what you don't believe? Let's connect as humans. This is the stuff that actually matters. And I'm hoping that the book at least creates that opportunity.
This book is really interesting. I've really enjoyed reading it. And I think it's good. Scott does talk about community a lot. It's important to this is what it's about, faith and community, which doesn't necessarily have to have any religion at all. The book is Mostly What God Does, Reflections on Seeking and Finding His Love Everywhere, by Savannah Guthrie and her AI friends. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. I so enjoyed it. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Kara.